Okay, so we are recording now, and so let me get to the, so we were talking about these self-interested gifts, and we talked about two things. We talked about, well, several things. We, just to summarize it for you, the last class, delegation, where the receiver, the decision maker, gives up the power to choose the action and hands over that power to the informed speaker, the sender. That is, unless the bias is too large, that is good for the receiver himself. The receiver becomes better off ex ante. Similarly, if the sender could somehow commit to honesty, that no matter what theta is, he'll honestly convey that value. If he has a way to make that commitment, then the sender is better off. Yes. Both of these are commitments, right? There has to be a way in which the power that is given up to the other side cannot be taken back later. Yes, that is absolutely critical to taking advantage of this sort of improvement. Now, we also saw the sort of, if more general commitments and mechanisms are possible, then what form does that optimal commitment take? And I discussed with you also the paper by Holmstrom and the follow-up paper by Goldsman and Pavlov, which basically says that, even in the sort of most, if you consider all theoretical kinds of delegation of mechanisms that are possible, the optimal mechanism from the receiver's point of view essentially amounts to some sort of restricted delegation with an upper bound. Okay, this is the case where the bias is positive, the bias is upwards. If the bias were downwards, the same thing would apply, except there would be a lower bound placed on the actions that can be taken. But anyway, it takes the form of full delegation, but restricted delegation. That is not allowed to choose an action above this upper bound 1 minus b, but subject to that, the sender is empowered to take any action that he wants to take. Now, I'll talk about one last kind of manifestation of this principle, which we are calling rights as self-interested gifts, right? These are all examples: delegation, commitment to honesty, or transparency. These are all examples of conferring rights on other players in a way that's Pareto improving. That's good for everyone. So let me talk about the issue of free speech. Here we are again going to this uniform quadratic model of Crawford-Sobel. So I'm going to make an argument that an argument in favor of free speech, okay, which is again based on the Pareto principle, not on sort of ethical, moral arguments, but based on the interests of all parties concerned. So, some powerful entity like a government, for example, or international organization or whoever, can in certain domains restrict speech. So let's say, to give a concrete example, suppose there's information out there about the state of the economy. How much is the inflationary pressure, or how much is the recessionary pressure in the economy right now? Right? Economic agents want to know that before choosing making the private decisions. For example, business people may want to know whether the future looks bleak, right? Whether the economy is bullish or bearish before they choose to make investments in new projects. If they think that the recession is coming on, they will want to postpone their investments. And that may actually become a self-fulfilling prophecy, as we know from Keynes. Similarly, if there are inflationary tendencies in the economy, if the Reserve Bank has found secretly through their surveys and data collection that there are inflationary pressures and expectations, if that information is released, then once again, it will alter people's choices, right? Labor unions may demand higher wages, et cetera, et cetera. So once again, that may feed into actual inflation and so on. A government can sort of monitor the media to suppress or control such information getting released to the public. Okay, free speech would mean that the media is free to report whatever information is out there about, survey results on inflationary expectations or recessionary expectations, etc. Or the government can apply some sort of censorship that the media is not allowed to report freely. Okay, the media may have to sort of route what they report in their television channels and newspapers through a censoring agency. The government has to approve what is being said publicly. So we'll model that in a very simple way in this Crawford-Sobel framework. So this is the standard Crawford-Sobel game. Yes. There's a standard game. It's a two-player game. There's a state of the world, which the sender learns, then the sender sends a message to the receiver takes an action. So think of this as a free speech regime. So the state of the world is some unknown variable of the economy, which has been found through surveys. And the sender is the media. Okay, so the media learns what the survey has revealed about the state of the economy. And then the media can publish that message through its channels. And the receiver is the ordinary citizen who makes economic choices. Okay, so the receiver listens to the message of the sender and chooses an action. Now, it's possible that there can be some conflict of interest between the media and the citizen, right? The media may want to, direct the actions taken by citizens in a certain direction. Okay, so we can allow for that. So the media has a bias B. So for example, the media may want the average agent or citizen in the economy to invest more, maybe. Yeah. So there's a bias factor B, positive. Now, we'll contrast this with a three-player game. So what's a three-player game? It's basically reflecting a regime of control speech. So the third player, which we'll bring in, is this censor, right? Somebody who sits between the sender, the media, and the citizen, and controls the flow of messages between these two parties. So again, the state of the world is realized, the sender received that. The sender then has to send a message not directly to the citizen, but to the censor, okay? And the censor, after hearing this message, will send a message M prime to the citizen, or allow a message M prime to be sent to the citizen, same thing, okay? And the censor's bias is B prime. Both these biases are measured relative to the citizen's preferences, okay? And the interesting case is where the censor has a bigger bias. So the media wants to push people's choices in a more business-friendly direction, but the government wants to push it even more. Okay, so P prime, this bias is bigger. Is the game clear to everyone? So the question is, yes. Go ahead. Was there a question? Okay, so the question that we'll try to understand and answer is, which game is better, right? Is it this free speech game where the censor has basically removed itself from the picture and there can be unrestricted communication between the media and the citizen? Is this regime the better one, or is this control regime the better one? Now, of course, that question, leads to the question that better for whom, Maybe it's better for the media and its objectives. It's better for the citizen. The argument is going to be it's better for the censor. So the censor is better off playing that the two parties play this free speech game rather than this game where the censor takes an active role. So the censor, in other words, is better off removing himself from the picture altogether or committing to remove himself from the picture. Okay. So let's see why that is the case. So I'll sketch the argument for you. And to do that, we have already analyzed the two-player game, right? That's the standard profit-solving model. So what we need to understand and look at identify the equilibrium is this three-player game. What happens in the three-player game in equilibrium, in a perfect Bayesian equilibrium? So let's take a look at that. Okay, so this, what I'm saying here is borrowed from this paper, Attila, Ambrose, and others. I already discussed this, so I'll move forward to the next slide. So to understand the equilibrium of the three-player censorship game, let me first at the outset make a claim, okay? And then I'll give you the reasoning behind that claim. The claim is as follows. If we go back to the two-player game, what kind of equilibrium do we have in that two-player game? They're all partitional equilibria, right? So the state space, all possible values of theta between 0, 1, 8, divided into a number of different intervals, yes? And the message essentially conveys which of these several intervals theta lies in, okay? So the interval is identified, not the exact value of theta. And we also saw that there is a most informative equilibrium, right? An equilibrium with the highest number of intervals in the partition. And that's also the equilibrium which produces the highest welfare. So we'll kind of focus on the most informative equilibrium. Okay. Now, here's my claim. In this three-player game, what happens is you get similar partitional equilibria effectively. The decision maker, which is the citizen, the ordinary citizen, will eventually learn which of several intervals theta lies in. Okay, so same kind of partitional equilibria arise. And the partitional equilibria of the three-player game, the censorship game, is a subset of the partitional equilibria of the two-player game. I'll sketch the proof of all of these claims, okay? But let me state the claim clearly. So when you have the censorship game, you essentially have a subset of the equilibria that you had in the two-player unrestricted free speech, two-player sender-receiver game. And sometimes it's a strict subset. Sometimes some of the equilibria partitions of the original game survive the presence of the censor, but some don't. Now, when it's a strict subset, the equilibria that get destroyed are from the more informative end of the spectrum. So for example, if the original sender-receiver two-player game, free speech environment, if that had up to 7 interval partitions, okay, you may have, under censorship, you may have the 7 interval equilibrium and the 6 interval equilibrium destroyed, but anything from 5 intervals downwards remains, okay? So the more informative equilibria of the free speech environment can get killed because of censorship. We'll show that, okay? And then remember that the more informative equilibria are better for everyone, for all parties, all players. We have proved that before. So therefore, since those better equilibria are destroyed because of censorship, that leads to the conclusion that everyone is worse off because of censorship. This includes the original sender, the original receiver, but also the censor. So the government or whichever entity is trying to suppress information is better off committing not to do so, okay, from their own perspective, not from anybody else's perspective. Okay, so let me, is that clear? Should I repeat anything I said? Okay, so let me sketch a proof of the claim that I just made. Now, one thing I should have said, and probably didn't, is that the informational assumption is that the value of theta, the realized value of theta, is only known to the sender. The other two players don't know it. Okay. So in the censorship game, when the sender sends a message M to the censor sitting in the middle, the censor doesn't necessarily learn what theta exactly is. The censor only gets the information contained in the message M. So there's asymmetric information between the sender and the other players in the game. Okay, so in the censorship game, what kind of equilibria can we have? So we begin with the observation that the best the sensor can do is lump several messages into one. What do I mean by that? Let me kind of use the whiteboard here. So let's say at the first sort of part of the game, the sender is breaking up the state space. These are all theta values. This is 0, this is 1. And suppose there's a 3-interval kind of, partition in the original message. So there's the original message could either be M1 or M2 or M3, corresponding to these 3 intervals. Okay. Now, what are the options open to the censor, the second player in the middle? The censor is sending his own message M1, sorry, M prime. So one is to faithfully convey what he has heard. So sort of create a message M prime, which corresponds to the message he has heard M1, create another message M2 prime, which corresponds to the message M2 that he has heard, or M3 prime corresponding to M3. So he can faithfully pass on essentially what he has heard from the sender. But the censor can also lump some of these together. So for example, he can lump M1 and M2 together. So his own first message, M1 prime, may corresponding to either of these 2 messages. So when he hears M1, he sends this message. When he hears M2 also, he sends this message. And then he sends a different message, M2 prime, corresponding to an original message of M3. Okay. So this is an example where he is manipulating the information. Okay. He's lumping some of these messages together. Now, suppose there's an equilibrium of this kind. The original sender sends 3 distinct messages, M1, M2, M3. The next guy lumps the first 2 messages together. Okay. Now, since the original sender knows that his messages M1, M2 will be lumped together, right? They won't be distinguished when it's passed on. He might as well do the lumping himself. It makes no difference to his payoff. So you can create another equilibrium, which is outcome equivalent, okay? Where even the original sender, instead of sending these 2 distinct messages, M1, M2, sends some common message, M0, for the first 2 intervals. Yes, he knowing that his 2 messages will be not distinguished by the censor, he sort of lumps them together himself, right? That will also be an equilibrium, and it will make no difference to the payoffs, right? Does everybody see that? Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you on that point. So what does that mean? That means that without loss of generality, we can look at equilibria where the censor does not censor in equilibrium. In the example which I just put up, yes, there may be an equilibrium where the original sender sends 3 messages, but the sender only sends out 2 messages, the censor, by lumping them together. But there will be an equivalent equilibrium where the original sender himself sends 2 messages and the censor passes them on faithfully. Okay, so there's no loss of generality in trying to look at only equilibria where censorship doesn't happen on the equilibrium path. Although the fact that the censor is sitting there influences the nature of the equilibrium, but literally speaking, it doesn't happen on the equilibrium path, provided nobody deviates. So we'll look at equilibria of that kind. Okay.
Sir?
Yes.
Sir, but why would the censor want to lump the messages?
He may, right? Because the censor has a very different objective. We'll check the details in a moment. You'll see that sometimes, there's can be such an incentive, but the very general answer to your question is, we can have a situation where the censor has heard that the message is M1. So the censor himself believes that theta lies in this interval. The censor may have an interest in persuading the receiver, the ordinary citizen, to believe that theta actually lies in the second interval. The censor may have some incentive to do so, right? We are looking at positive biases. So if the censor is extremely biased, let's say theta is how good the economy's health is by some indicator. Yes. So it has been learned, the censor has learned that it lies in some lowest range. But if the censor wants citizens to take higher actions, like more investments, more consumer spending, then the censor may want to lie and say, oh, what I've heard is theta lies in the second interval. But that may lead to more investment and spending. Yes. So
okay,
we have to check against such temptations of the censor. Okay, so as I said, we'll only look at equilibria which have the property that there's no censorship in equilibrium. So that means two sets of incentive constraints have to be satisfied by any equilibrium of this kind. One is the same thing that we had in the two-player game. Remember, in the two-player game, if we have a partition equilibrium, at the cutoff points, the sender has to be indifferent between sending the left message and the right message. Okay, so that property still has to hold. The original sender's incentives have to be taken into account in the same way that we did in the two-player game. In addition, in the equilibrium that we're talking about, there has to be a no censorship condition for the censor. So the censor should not want to, in the equilibrium, to lump any of these messages that comes from the sender. So if we now compare with, yes.
I'm just getting confused. Like, how are we defining the payoffs for the censor?
So the censor's payoff is exactly, all the payoffs are of the quadratic form. Well, why do I need? I'll just say in words. The censor's payoff is exactly like the sender's payoff, right? What is the sender's payoff? It's minus of theta plus b minus action A, right? So you just replace the b by b prime, some other bias number factor. Otherwise, it's so everybody's payoff is from that same quadratic error loss class. It's just that their bliss points are different by that parameter b. Okay, so all right. So now, in the two-player game, which is the free speech environment, where the media can communicate with the public in an unrestricted manner. There, we only had the first set of incentive constraints, right? The indifference property at the threshold, at the cutoff points. Only those conditions applied in the two-player game. In the three-player censorship game, some additional set of incentive constraints come in, namely the no censorship conditions. Okay. So obviously, any partition which satisfies both sets of these incentive constraints will satisfy the first set trivially, right? So every equilibrium partition of this game that we're looking at, the censorship game, will be an equilibrium of the corresponding two-player game, okay? But the reverse is not true. An equilibrium of the two-player game may not be an equilibrium here because of the extra incentive constraints that need to be satisfied, okay? So having censorship reduces the equilibrium set. It doesn't create new equilibria. It just eliminates some of the equilibria of the original two-player game. That's the conclusion we arrive at. Okay. The only additional thing is that if some equilibrium partition of the original game does not survive, it has to be from the higher end, right? It has to start with the most informative equilibrium getting knocked off. And then maybe the second most informative equilibrium, it gets eroded from the top end, not the lower end. The babbling equilibrium is always there in any game. It's from the more informative end. Why is that? Let's do one thing. I'll come to the question of why more informative equilibria get eliminated. First, let's check further. Let's think about the incentive. So in the original two-player game, there is some partitional equilibria. Right? The zeros is like theta 1, this is like theta 2, and so on. Okay. How do we check whether, so in the original game, in this first interval, there's a message M1. In the second interval, there's a different message M2. Now, how do we check whether the censor wants, when he has heard M1, would he want to lie and report M2? What do we need to guarantee that doesn't happen? That incentive isn't there. Well, let's look at it systematically. When the censor has actually heard the message M1, he knows that theta truly belongs to this lowest range. And so the expected value of theta is theta 1 by 2. Yes. And this will also be the action that is chosen. If he doesn't lie and tell the receiver that, you know what, theta really falls in the first interval, the receiver will believe that and will take this action. But what does the censor truly want? What is his bliss point when he hears this message? So C's bliss point. What would he have chosen if he could choose action himself? What is that bliss point? Anyone?
Theta plus B prime.
That's right. So not theta, which the expected value of theta, because the censor himself doesn't know theta exactly, right? So if he has heard M1, he knows theta lies in the first interval, so its expected value is theta 1 by 2. And so ideally, what he would like to be chosen, his bliss point after hearing the message M1, is this. Okay. Now, what if he lies? What if, even though he has heard M1, what if he falsely reports that he has heard M2? Then citizens, receivers, decision makers, they'll believe theta is from the second interval, and their action choice A2 is going to be theta 1 plus theta 2 divided by 2. Yes. So when the censor hears the message M1, this is his bliss point. And if he reports truthfully, the action chosen will be this red action. if he lies by one notch upwards, then the action that he will get is this. So the question is, which one of these two actions is closer to his bliss point, right? For him to truthfully pass on the message, it has to be the case that his bliss point, which we have written here, is closer to action A1 than action A2. In other words, theta 1 by 2 plus B prime minus action A1, right? What we have up there should be greater than, less than equal to this action minus his bliss point. Theta 1 plus theta 2 divided by 2 minus basically A2 minus this. And we know what A1, A2 are. We can do that substitution. So this inequality needs to be satisfied. Yes. Which will make sure that he doesn't want to lie and say M2 when he has heard M1. It turns out that this is the only incentive constraint you have to check. In principle, there are numerous incentive constraints, right? When he has heard M2, he may want to lie and say M2, M3, M4. There's many different lies he can tell. And similarly, for any other message, there are many different lies he can tell. But it turns out that, if he doesn't want to lie when he hears M1, if he doesn't want to lie just, with the next message, then he will not want to lie in any other permutation. Why is that? Because this incentive constraint is the hardest to satisfy. Yes. For example, suppose when he has heard the message M1, he doesn't want to falsely claim M2. Suppose that is true. This inequality holds. Well, then even M2 is too much. It gives rise to too high an action, as far as he's concerned. It's too far away from his bliss point. Well, if he tells bigger lies, M3, M4, etc., then the action goes further and further away from his bliss point. So he doesn't want to, if he doesn't want to tell the small lie, he doesn't want to tell the bigger lie either. Okay. And you can show that, if you start with some message M2 or M3, then again, all those other incentive constraints are implied by this incentive constraint. Yes.
So can you please explain the incentive constraint once again?
Okay, so look at this. First, let me explain, suppose he has heard M1. If we can guarantee that he doesn't want to lie just a little bit and say M2, then that automatically takes care of the possibility that he'll lie and say M3 or M4 or some higher up message. Why is that? See, this incentive constraint that he doesn't want to lie and say M2. What is this inequality? This inequality is saying that, if he tells the truth that the message was M1, the action will be A1. If he tells the small lie, M2, the action will be A2. And his own bliss point is closer to A1 than to A2. Right? It's somewhere in the middle, but closer to A1. That's what the meaning of this inequality is. Now, what if he told a bigger lie? What if he said that the message is actually M3 when it's truly M1? Well, that'll lead to another action, some even higher action, A3. Now, if A2 is already further from his bliss point than A1, then A3 will be even further away. So he doesn't want to do that. And he doesn't want to get A4 or A5, any of those things. So if the small lie in the upward direction is not worthwhile, then any bigger lie is not worthwhile either. Yes. Now, by the same token, we can show that if the true message heard is not, the very lowest message M1, but something in the middle, MK, then all we need to check is that he doesn't want to lie and say, I've heard MK plus 1. But if the incentive constraint between M1 and M2 is satisfied, then this incentive constraint will also be satisfied. That's because, you know, the left two messages, see the bias B prime is constant, okay? And the left two intervals are the smallest intervals in this partition. All the intervals further along the way are bigger, right? In the smallest interval, it's hardest to satisfy this property that the bliss point is closer to the left rather than to the right. Yes. Because
Yes,
what
got it.
the bliss point is, you know, the first action pushed up by B prime. So on the left side, things are closely packed together. So when you're tracking the bliss point, it gets the maximum sort of kick towards the next equilibrium action. Okay, so that's a very convenient property in the analysis, that we basically need to check one incentive constraint. Yes. And this incentive constraint, again, you know, is hardest to satisfy when you have the most informative equilibrium. Somewhat mechanically, we can show that by doing the following. Take an n-interval equilibrium of the original two-player game. We calculated everything, right, in the uniform quadratic case. The first action is going to be this. The second action is going to be this. This follows from the formula we derived. And theta 1, the cutoff point, is going to be this. And this turns out to be the incentive constraint. You can show that for higher and higher n, this is harder to satisfy. Right? This inequality, you throw in all these expressions, and it follows from there that higher values of n do not help making this inequality true. If anything, it may actually break down. So that's why equilibria get eliminated from the higher end. And that's once again has to do with, slightly hand waving way. When you have more informative equilibria, the first two intervals get smaller, they're shorter, because you're packing in more intervals in this 0-1 spectrum. And so you're having smaller initial intervals. And that's why incentive constraint becomes harder to satisfy. So if you can satisfy it for the most informative equilibrium, you can satisfy it for less informative ones, but not vice versa. Let me show you a numerical example to make it absolutely concrete. Okay. So here's an example. The bias between the two players, sender and receiver, is 1/16. But now comes a censor whose bias is bigger relative to the decision maker. It's 1/8. Now, if there were free speech, it was just left as a two-player game, then you can calculate, what are the equilibria. Turns out that there's a babbling equilibrium, there's a two-interval equilibrium, and there's a three-interval equilibrium, but nothing higher, right, for these parameter values. There are lots of exercises in your exams. You see that, often I give you some parameter values, ask you to calculate the partition equilibria. So you should be able to do it in your sleep. It turns out for these parameter values, this is the three-interval equilibrium, right? The cutoff points are 1/12, 5/12. The actions are 1/24. Actions are all the midpoints of these intervals. So 1/24, 1/4, 17/24. So this is a picture of the three-interval equilibrium. Now, if we now have the censorship game, the three-player game, question is, does this survive? And the answer is no, it does not survive. Why? Because we need to run this check that, this inequality, is it satisfied? No, right? You can plug in all the numbers and you can check that. Essentially, in this case, when the censor hears, well, let's actually run with it, okay? When the censor hears the message M1, the expected value of the state to him is 1/24. Okay. Now, what is his bliss point? What would he ideally like to choose? You add his bias, B prime, 1/8, to this 1/24. So what do you get? You get 4/24, which is 1/6. Okay. So ideally, when he hears the message M1, if he himself could choose the action, he would choose 1/6. That's his bliss point. But now he cannot do that. All he can do is lie and say that I've heard the message M2, which is a lie because he actually heard M1. Well, if he tells that lie, what is going to be the action chosen by the receiver? It's the middle action, 1/4. Yes. So the question is, his bliss point 1/8, is it closer to 1/4 or is it closer to 1/24? And the answer is it's closer to 1/4. 1/4 is like 2/8, so the distance is 1/8, whereas sorry, his bliss point is 1/6. So which is closer to 1/6, 1/4 or 1/24? I mean, that's just a simple calculation. Just do it yourself. You'll find that actually 1/4 is closer to the censor's bliss point, which is 1/6. So he will want to tell that lie, and that destroys this equilibrium. Okay. Now, in the original two-player game, there's also a two-interval equilibrium, unsurprisingly. And the cutoff point is 3/8. So here again, you can run the same check. That does this equilibrium survive? For that to happen, when he hears M1, he should have no incentive to lie and say M2. Okay. Well, if he tells the truth, the action will be 3/16. If he lies upward, the action will be 11/16. You can calculate what his bliss point is. His bliss point when he hears message M1 is 3/16 plus 1/8, his bias, right? So that point, is it closer to this or is it closer to that? Well, it turns out it's closer to 3/16. So he doesn't want to lie in this case. So bottom line is that the original sender receiver game in a free speech environment had this 3-interval equilibrium as well as the 2-interval equilibrium. But the moment you go to the censorship game, this equilibrium breaks down, but this one survives. Yes. So the censor is actually make things worse for himself, because even the censor ex ante would like this equilibrium to be played instead of this. Okay. So what is the sort of overarching idea over here? When some sort of authority, government, or whoever, you're trying to control the flow of information to citizens here. So what are you trying to do? You're trying to suppress bad news and only release good news. Okay. Something of that sort. When the information is unfavorable, you don't want people to know that. But when it's favorable, you want people to know that. Yes. So if you try to control speech, the information gets coarsened. So yes, when things are terrible, when theta is very low, when the state of the world is unfavorable, you do manage to let the actions not fall too low, right? So when the economic indicators are very bad, in a controlled speech environment, the government manages not to have investment or consumer spending or confidence collapse altogether, right? Compared to a free speech environment. But when the economic fundamentals are very good, yes, that's when you miss out on the opportunity through censorship. That's when the good news doesn't get communicated effectively, credibly to the population. And so in a free speech environment, that would have given rise to a business boom. FDI would have come in, private investment would have picked up, consumers would go out spend thinking that the economy is doing very well. But that doesn't happen because, if you're suppressing bad news, you're suppressing good news also in the process. And so the question is, how do these things, how do we weigh these two things against each other? And when you have this sort of concave utility, right, when the cost of wrong decisions increases in a convex fashion, suppressing speech means, you're increasing the variance in the error. What you ideally would have liked people to do and what they actually do, bigger gaps appear between those things. So notice one thing, that neither the sender in the original game nor the censor manages to affect people's decisions, the receiver's decision on average. Okay. So for example, if you take this equilibrium, the speaker, the sender, desperately is trying to increase the action taken. Okay. But if you look at this range, the range 1 to 1/12, if the receiver was fully informed, right, he would have chosen an action which is exactly the value of the state. So in this interval, what would his expected action be? It would be the midpoint of this, right, 124. In the cheap talk game, it's the same. The only difference in the cheap talk game is that it does not raise the average action in an interval. What it does is that it adds noise or variance, meaning that if in a full information environment, the action would have grazed the diagonal. Right? Here, the same average action is taken for all thetas in this range. So it just creates extra variance between bliss points and actions taken. And it doesn't change the average action, which is a reflection of this common saying that you can fool some of the people some of the time, but not all of the people all of the time. So as far as the receiver is concerned, you can fool the receiver sometimes into taking higher actions. So for example, look at again this interval, right? The receiver ideally want to choose on the diagonal. In the equilibrium, the red line is the relevant choice. Okay. So for values of theta below the average, okay, the red line is higher than the diagonal. So you're managing to fool the receiver into choosing a higher action than he would have chosen otherwise. But notice that for values of theta above the expected value, above this point of intersection, the red line is below the diagonal, right? So in spite of the sender having an upward bias, trying to increase the action for this entire range, he actually manages in equilibrium to reduce the action than what the receiver himself would have chosen. So he just manages, all he wants to, he doesn't change the average action. All he does is that he creates these gaps between the diagonal and the red line. And that is in nobody's interest because they're in some sense risk averse because of the quadratic loss function. Okay, so any speech environment like a commitment to honesty or removal of censorship, what it does is that with the same average action taken, the same expected action taken, it reduces this variance I was talking about, and that's why it's a win-win for everyone. Okay, guys, I'll